Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story.
Subscribe, like, and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
It was one of those picture-perfect spring Sundays, the kind that looks good in photos, but feels like something's crawling under your skin if you sit still too long. The kind of day where the sun shines too bright, the lawn's too green, and the air smells like fresh-cut lies. My name's Ella, and I've been dreading this Easter lunch since the invite hit my inbox 3 weeks ago. Not because I don't like ham or mashed potatoes. Not even because I hate my family, because hate would mean I still care in the way they want me to. I dread these lunches because everyone here plays pretend like they're in a Hallmark commercial, but behind those plastic smiles, they're all locked and loaded with gossip, judgment, and years of Cold War tension that never really went anywhere. We were seated around the long oak table at Aunt Linda's house, the same table that's been hosting family holidays since I was a teenager. My Uncle Bob was carving the ham like a man on autopilot, eyes glazed over, mouth set in a neutral line. My cousin Brian was already on his second glass of wine, his wife Danielle fiddling with the silverware like she couldn't decide whether to use it to eat or stab him in the leg. Across from me sat Aunt Linda, still wearing that too-tight pastel sweater and those pearls she always wears when she wants to remind you she's better than you, even when she's being humble about it. I'd barely taken my first bite of potato salad when she leaned in slightly, tipped her head just enough to make it look casual, and said, "Well, you know Ella's always been emotionally unstable." Just loud enough for the whole table to hear. No one flinched. No one corrected her. Not even Bob. The room just kept chewing, swallowing, pretending like she hadn't just slapped me across the face with a smile on her lips. I didn't say a word, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. I just reached into my bag, pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying all morning, and slid it across the table toward her with 2 fingers like it was nothing more than a receipt. Her name written clean and sharp on the front. Linda froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, hand trembling just the tiniest bit. Her eyes flicked from me to Bob, then back to me. She didn't open it right away, but she knew. You could see it in the way the color drained from her cheeks. She knew. And the thing is, I could have said something. I could have told everyone how Bob came to me a week ago, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a decade, hands shaking as he poured his coffee, telling me he couldn't do it anymore. That he'd found out about Linda's spiritual guidance sessions with the church's associate pastor weren't so spiritual. That he'd found her burner phone, her fake email, the receipts for hotel rooms in a town 30 miles away. That he'd seen the messages, read the words. And he still blamed himself for not seeing it sooner. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Because here's the thing no one likes to admit, especially in families like mine. The ones that go to church every Sunday and wear pastel and smile with their teeth. They don't like talking about what happens behind closed doors, especially when it doesn't match the narrative. And the narrative about me? Well, I've been difficult since I was 12. Since I started asking questions. Since I told Linda once that I didn't like how she talked to my mom when she thought no one else could hear. Since I refused to pretend like nothing ever happened in our family. Since I stopped calling her Auntie. You know how some families have that one person who carries all the blame, all the shame, all the stories everyone else wants to forget? That's me. I'm the one they point to when they need a reason why things feel off. Not the affairs. Not the emotional abuse. Not the secrets that smell like rot under the floorboards. Me. I remember being 15 and overhearing her tell my mother, Ella just doesn't know how to be grateful. She's too sensitive. Too dramatic. And I remember my mother not saying a word in my defense. Just sipping her coffee and nodding like she agreed. That moment lived inside me for years, burned into my brain like a scar I couldn't scrub out. So when Linda said what she said today, when she played that same old card in front of everyone, she wasn't trying to insult me. She was trying to reestablish the narrative. Trying to remind everyone who I was supposed to be in this story. The unstable one. The dramatic niece. The broken little girl who never grew up. And I let her think she still had that power, just long enough to watch it break. When she finally opened the envelope, it was like time slowed. You could feel the air shift, heavy and thick like a summer storm about to drop. Her eyes scanned the first page, and I watched her throat bob as she swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Her face froze in a half smile, half mask of something between disbelief and panic. And Bob? He didn't even look at her. He just kept eating his ham, slow and steady, like he'd finally made peace with something. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just sat there, sipping my water, wondering how many people at that table would try to spin this too. Wondering who'd pretend they didn't see it coming and who would whisper that maybe I made Bob do it, that I poisoned him somehow. Because when you're the scapegoat, everything that goes wrong is somehow your fault. You break a silence that's been choking the room for years, and suddenly, you're the bad guy. But here's the part Linda didn't expect. Here's what none of them expected. I didn't come to that lunch to argue. I came to end a chapter. And as I watched her fold those papers back into the envelope with shaking hands, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. But freedom, like truth, has a cost. And we'd barely started paying it. The moment the papers touched the table, you could feel it like a shift in gravity, like something had cracked in the center of the room and was quietly leaking tension into every corner, thick and slow like molasses. No one said anything. Not right away. The sound of forks tapping on china stopped, like the whole damn table had hit pause. Even the ceiling fan seemed quieter, like it knew something was coming that didn't belong in this room full of curated smiles and pastel Easter sweaters. Linda stared at the envelope like it was radioactive, her fingers twitching around the silverware, too proud to reach for it too fast, too smart to pretend she didn't know what it was. Her face didn't move much, but the eyes gave her away. You learn to watch the eyes when you grow up with people like her. Eyes are harder to fake than words. Her mouth pulled into something that was almost a smirk, but not quite. Like she was trying to find the script and couldn't remember what line came next. Bob still didn't look at her. That's what really did it. Not the papers. Not even me. It was Bob sitting there calm as a stone, chewing his food like nothing had happened, not offering a single damn word. That silence from him, it was louder than anything I could have said. I knew this moment would come, but even I wasn't ready for the weight of it. All the years I'd been called dramatic, unstable, manipulative, emotional, all of it had been building to this. And still, I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When the truth finally shows up at the table, it doesn't need to shout. It just sits there, heavy and undeniable. Linda finally picked up the envelope with 2 fingers like it was something dirty. She didn't open it right away, just stared at it like she could will it into being something else. But eventually, curiosity or fear won. She pulled the flap open and slid the papers out slow, careful, like maybe there was a bomb inside. And I guess in a way there was. She scanned the top sheet, then the second, and when her eyes landed on Bob's signature, her whole body shifted. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, a subtle straightening of the spine, a tightening around the mouth. Not tears. Not yelling. Just this eerie stillness that only people who are used to controlling every room they walk into know how to do when they suddenly don't. Bob, she said his name like a warning, but he didn't look up. Didn't blink. Just kept chewing. And I knew then that it had already happened. Whatever argument, whatever denial or crocodile tears she might have tried, he was already past it. That's the thing people like Linda don't understand. Sometimes, silence is the final nail. Flashback 1 week. Same table, different hour. No ham, no company. Just me and Bob and a pot of oversteeped coffee between us. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired you fix with a nap, but soul tired. Like the weight of 30 years had finally landed full force on his chest, and he couldn't breathe under it anymore. He told me he wanted out. Not in a dramatic, runaway kind of way. Just quiet. Resigned. Like a man who had finally admitted he was drowning and didn't want to pretend anymore that the water was fine. He didn't tell me everything. Not then. But I saw enough in his face to know he didn't need to. There were things I recognized. The haunted look of someone who's lived with subtle cruelty so long it starts to feel normal. He told me he didn't want to make a scene. Said he knew she'd twist it if he tried to leave without someone else seeing it. That's why he came to me. Because I'd seen her true face before. Because he knew I wouldn't let her rewrite the story again. I asked him if he was sure. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a man setting down a heavy suitcase he's been carrying too long. Said he'd already met with the lawyer. Said he just needed help delivering it in a way she couldn't ignore. So I agreed. Not because I wanted revenge. Not even because I thought it would fix anything. But because someone finally stood up and said the thing no one else would say. Enough. And now here we were. Back in the room. Back at the table. Watching the house of cards start to tremble. Brian cleared his throat, tried to play peacemaker. Everything okay? He asked, voice thin and shaky, eyes darting between his mom and his uncle like a kid caught in the middle of a fight he didn't want to admit was happening. Linda didn't answer. She folded the papers back into the envelope with slow, precise hands and set them beside her plate. Well, she said, voice clipped and falsely sweet. This is certainly an interesting Easter. Bob reached for the butter. And I just looked around the table, watching the gears turn behind every forced smile and averted gaze. Danielle stared at the tablecloth like it had answers. My younger cousin Mark texted under the table, pretending none of this concerned him. My mother took a sip of wine and kept her mouth shut. She'd always been good at that. Have you ever had someone in your family act one way in public and a whole different way behind closed doors? What would you have done if you were in Ella's shoes? Like, comment, or share your story below. And still, I didn't explain. Didn't tell them what Linda had done. Didn't mention the hotel receipts or the hidden email. I let the silence sit there. I let the envelope do the talking. Because sometimes, letting the lie die on its own is more powerful than trying to kill it yourself. I watched Linda gather herself, rebuild the mask brick by brick, prepping for whatever story she'd spin later. Maybe she'd say Bob was having a midlife crisis. Maybe she'd accuse me of meddling, of planting ideas in his head. She'd have her version. She always did. But something had shifted. A crack in the foundation. And the thing about cracks is, once they start, they only get wider. Linda had always played the role of the righteous matriarch, the church-going, casserole-baking glue of the family. But that glue was flammable and the fire had started. And I wasn't going to put it out. Bob was never the type to raise his voice, never the man to make a scene. Never once in 30 damn years did he cause ripples in that still, suffocating lake Linda called our home. He was the steady one, the guy you called when the garbage disposal broke or when someone needed to move a couch or fix a dripping faucet. He showed up on time, paid bills early, and never, ever contradicted his wife in public. People thought that made him loyal. Dependable. The kind of husband other women half-joked they wished they had. But silence is a tricky thing. It can look a hell of a lot like peace when, in reality, it's just fear wearing a polite smile. I remember the way he looked when he came to me that morning, 5 days before Easter, sitting in my apartment like he wasn't sure whether to take off his shoes or just disappear into the wall. His hands were shaking, even though he tried to hide it behind that same old stoic calm. He was still wearing his work boots, mud-caked in the treads, like he'd walked straight off a job site and into the middle of a confession. And maybe that's exactly what he'd done. Ella, he started, voice low and rough like sandpaper against raw wood. I need your help with something, and I need you to promise you won't tell your aunt just yet. That was how it began, no warning, no preamble, just those 2 sentences and a weight in the air that told me he wasn't talking about fixing a leaky sink. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his jacket, the kind you buy in bulk at an office supply store, and handed it to me like it was something radioactive. Inside were 6 handwritten letters. Folded tight, marked with dates in the top right corners, they looked ordinary. But I hadn't even opened the first one before I knew they weren't. I found them in the attic, he said, watching me too carefully, as if waiting for me to flinch. Tucked inside a shoebox with your aunt's high school yearbooks. I wasn't snooping, swear to God. I was just looking for the damn Christmas lights. I opened the first letter. Neat cursive. Too neat. It started innocently enough, how most poison does. Dear Linda, it read, I can't stop thinking about the last time we met. Every time I pass by the church office, I remember the way you touched my arm when you said goodbye. I stopped reading right there. Because I knew that tone. That coded language. That bullshit subtlety wrapped in false holiness. I didn't even need to ask who it was from. It's him, I said. The associate pastor. Pastor Greg. Bob nodded, his jaw tightening the way it did when he was trying not to say something he couldn't take back. There's more, he said, pulling out a second object, a cheap black flip phone, scuffed along the edges, battery held in place by a strip of tape. Found this taped to the underside of her vanity drawer. It still had power. No lock screen. And just like that, the truth started to unravel. The messages weren't outright pornographic. Linda was smarter than that, but they didn't need to be. They were suggestive, intimate in a way that made your skin crawl, all punctuated with Bible quotes and phrases like soul connection and divine longing. That sick mixture of lust and piety that only someone deeply manipulative or deeply deluded could pull off. Bob didn't speak while I scrolled. He just sat there, hands in his lap, eyes on the carpet, like a man who'd just walked into his own funeral. I knew he hadn't processed it yet. 30 years of marriage, built on routine and appearances, and now here he was, watching it all crumble under the weight of evidence that didn't lie. What are you going to do? I finally asked him. I don't know, he said. I don't want to blow up the family. I don't want to make a scene. But I can't keep living like this, Ella. I can't keep pretending she's someone she's not. That was the moment I understood something about Bob I hadn't before. He wasn't a weak man. He wasn't spineless. He was exhausted. The kind of exhausted that settles deep into your bones and whispers to you that maybe you're the crazy one for thinking things should feel different. He had spent years being emotionally held hostage by a woman who wore virtue like armor and wielded it like a knife. But there was something else in those letters, something Bob hadn't fully picked up on yet, or maybe he had, and just didn't want to face it. I noticed patterns, repeated phrases, timelines that didn't line up. The dates on some of those letters? They weren't recent. They went back years. Possibly decades. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This wasn't some late-life crisis or emotional affair. This had roots. And suddenly, I had a new theory forming in the back of my mind, one I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Because if I was right, Linda hadn't just emotionally manipulated her way through their marriage, she'd been planting traps and exits since the beginning. Bob wasn't just discovering betrayal. He was discovering that the life he thought he'd built might never have existed at all. I promised him I wouldn't say anything until he was ready. I told him I'd stand by him, that I'd help him deliver the papers, that I'd make sure she couldn't spin it into another story where she was the victim and everyone else was too blind to see it. He thanked me with the kind of gratitude that hurts to watch, like he couldn't believe someone would stand up for him after all these years. And in that moment, I realized Bob wasn't just trying to escape Linda. He was trying to remember who he was before she told him who he should be. What Bob found in that attic wasn't just proof of betrayal. It was the first crack in the mirror he'd been forced to look into for 30 years. And once a crack starts, it doesn't stop. You don't walk away from that kind of realization without paying a price. And I had a sick feeling that price hadn't even been tallied yet. Some families don't need words to decide who you are. They assign your role early, long before you understand what's being taken from you, and by the time you realize it's all been carved in stone, you're already halfway through living it. In our family, Brian was the golden child, the crown prince, the miracle boy who could do no wrong, even while doing every damn thing wrong behind closed doors. And me? I was the ghost, the emotional problem, the unstable one. The one they loved to shake their heads over during coffee breaks, while whispering to each other that I was just so sensitive. Bless her heart. It wasn't just subtle. It was strategic. That kind of scapegoating doesn't happen by accident. Growing up, it wasn't obvious at first. Not until middle school, when you start noticing the way people look at you after your name comes up in conversation. I could tell something had shifted after Brian got caught with weed in his backpack, and Linda spun it into a story where he'd been protecting me from getting in trouble. She told the family I was going through a hard time emotionally, and that Brian had made a poor choice trying to protect his cousin. I still remember the burn of humiliation sitting across from her at the dinner table the night she told that story, her hand wrapped around her wine glass like a weapon, her voice soft and heavy with faux concern as she painted me into a version of myself I didn't recognize. And when I opened my mouth to correct her, she smiled and said, "Sweetheart, it's okay. We know you don't remember it right." That was her game. If she could frame the narrative fast enough, no one questioned the facts. If I resisted, I was unstable. If I cried, I was hysterical. If I stayed quiet, well, silence always looks like guilt when no one's on your side. And Brian? He never once corrected her. Not once. Not when she blamed me for the dent in her car that he made sneaking out one night to meet a girl from the next town over. Not when she accused me of stealing $20 from her purse when I was 14, even though I knew Brian had been siphoning off her cash for months to buy cheap beer. He just sat there, smirking, letting me absorb every blow like it was a game. Like I was just the designated scapegoat, and he was simply playing his part as the star. Linda didn't protect Brian because she didn't see his flaws. She protected him because he was hers, and I wasn't. And in her world, loyalty only extended as far as blood ties and usefulness. I was my mother's daughter, and somewhere deep in Linda's twisted pride, that was a sin she never forgave me for. The older we got, the worse it got. Brian went off to college and partied his way through 5 years of mediocrity while Linda bragged about his academic journey to anyone who'd listen. I, on the other hand, was working 2 jobs, putting myself through community college, and still being painted as the unstable one for going to therapy. I remember the Christmas when I mentioned I'd started seeing a counselor, and Linda laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Well, at least you're finally admitting you need help." And the room joined in, not with laughter maybe, but with that awful, complicit silence that says we're not going to stop her because it's easier this way. The truth is, I could have handled being the outsider. What broke me was being made into the villain in a story where I was just trying to survive. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't unstable. I was reacting like any sane person does when they're constantly gaslit, ignored, and quietly erased. I stopped attending family dinners for 2 years in my 20s, thinking maybe they'd notice I was gone. They didn't. Brian got engaged to some girl whose name I can't remember, and Linda mailed me an invitation with the wrong address. Said it was an accident. I knew better. So when I walked into that Easter lunch last week with the divorce papers in my purse, I wasn't just carrying Bob's truth. I was carrying decades of mine. I was done being the ghost. And I wanted every single one of them to see it, to feel it, to sit with the version of me that didn't apologize for breathing anymore. Brian, of course, had slipped right back into his golden role. Sitting across from me in his tailored shirt and smug grin, swirling wine in his glass like he was in some Napa Valley tasting room instead of sitting on top of a lifetime of lies. He didn't look at me after I slid the envelope across the table. But I watched his jaw twitch, watched the way his hand tightened on the stem of that glass like something deep inside him recognized that the game had changed and maybe the board wasn't his anymore. He didn't say a word while Linda read the divorce papers. Didn't offer her a single comforting touch. And I saw it then, how brittle the whole thing really was. He'd been propped up by her all his life, but now she was crumbling, and the cracks were spreading in every direction. You could see it in the way he kept adjusting his shirt collar, glancing sideways like he wanted to leave, but didn't know how to do it without looking like a coward. I had once believed that I would never get the truth out into the open. That Linda would keep spinning her stories until the day she died, and Brian would coast through life on the fumes of her protection. But watching them both at that table, watching the golden child start to flinch and the queen start to lose her throne, I realized something I hadn't dared to hope for. Their lies were finally running out of room, and I was no longer afraid of being the ghost. Because now I was the witness, and I was done being quiet. Secrets never start with fire. They start with friction, with one tiny movement against another, so small it seems harmless until you realize the heat has been building quietly for years, and now everything around you smells like smoke. That's what it felt like in the days after Easter, after the papers were delivered, after Linda's smile cracked and Bob's silence turned into something deeper than grief. It was detachment, and it was deliberate. The family had returned to their respective corners of the battlefield, pretending not to know what they'd just seen happen at that table. No calls, no texts, just the thick, awkward stillness of people who'd rather lose each other than face the truth. But the truth wasn't done. It had more to say, and it was about to speak louder than it ever had before. It started with Bob showing up at my place again, unannounced, which he'd never done before. He was holding a small wooden box, the kind old men keep cufflinks or war medals in, only this one was dusty, dented, and looked like it had been hidden for years. He sat down at my kitchen table, didn't ask for coffee, just opened the box like it was full of snakes, and laid out its contents like he was building a crime scene. Inside were 2 more letters older than the ones before, dated nearly 2 decades earlier. Folded neatly, but time-stained and brittle. The first wasn't addressed to Linda. It was from her. And it wasn't to the pastor either. It was addressed to someone with a name neither of us recognized, Nathaniel. The handwriting was the same, but the tone was different. Younger. Bolder. It wasn't a letter of love. It was a letter of regret and calculation, written like someone mapping a strategy instead of confessing feelings. In it, Linda talked about how she felt trapped with Bob, how she had to build a life worth staying in even if it meant sacrificing emotional truth. That phrase stuck with me, haunted me for days afterward. Sacrificing emotional truth. Like it was a noble thing, not a selfish betrayal. She spoke of needing to keep her family intact for the sake of appearances, and hinted at future opportunities with men of higher calling. The kind of language that sounds poetic until you realize it's just a nice way to talk about using people like chess pieces. Bob didn't speak much while I read it, but when I looked up, his eyes were glassy and red, not with fresh tears, but old ones, the kind that have dried on the inside long ago. He nodded toward the second letter and said, "That one's worse." And he wasn't wrong. That one was from Pastor Greg, the same man who baptized my cousin's daughter and gave the eulogy at my mother's funeral. The man who stood in our pulpit every Sunday talking about integrity and marriage and the sanctity of truth. In this letter, he wrote to Linda about their deep spiritual connection and unspoken covenant. He wrote about how they'd always known they were meant to be in each other's lives, that their souls had been tied before this life, whatever the hell that means. But then came the part that chilled the air in my apartment. He mentioned how careful she'd been to keep the past buried, and how grateful he was that Ella's mother never suspected anything back then. I read that line 3 times before it hit me like a shovel to the chest. My mother, dead 5 years. A woman who had spent most of her life standing just slightly behind Linda, always agreeing with her, always defending her even when she seemed unsure why. And suddenly, I had a question I couldn't shake. What the hell did Linda have to hide from my mother? I didn't tell Bob what I suspected, not yet, but I went digging. I knew my mother used to keep a shoebox of cassette tapes, old recorded messages and therapy sessions she'd done with her counselor back in the 90s when she was struggling with anxiety and burnout from caregiving. She never let anyone listen to them. Said they were her way of talking to herself in a safe room. I hadn't touched them since she passed. They were in a box in my closet, sealed shut with painter's tape like something sacred. That night, I sat on the floor of my bedroom with a battered tape player and a glass of bourbon, hitting play and fast forward, skipping through hours of tearful monologues and confessions until one tape made me freeze. The voice wasn't just my mother's. It was hers and Linda's. The label said November 97, family session. I hit rewind and sat through the hiss of old tape unspooling, hard in my throat. The conversation started normal enough. My mother talking about feeling overwhelmed, about how she always felt like Linda overshadowed her. And then Linda's voice came in sharper, colder than I'd ever heard it. She wasn't counseling. She was controlling. She was steering the conversation in that slippery way she always had, turning my mother's self-doubt into an opportunity to center herself. Then she said something that flipped my world upside down. "She's too much like her father," Linda said, referring to me. "And you know how that ended. You're lucky she doesn't remember." My mother didn't respond right away, but when she did, she sounded scared. We agreed never to talk about that again. Linda laughed. "It's not like she'll ever find out." I stopped the tape. I didn't know what it meant. Not fully, but I knew it meant something more than I'd ever imagined. Something my mother was ashamed of. Something Linda was still using, even after death, to keep her hands clean. I sat there for a long time, tape still whirring, bourbon untouched, staring at the wall as if it could offer answers. All I had now were questions about my father, who I barely remembered, questions about what Linda did, or knew, or buried before I was old enough to understand what silence meant in a house that smiled too much. There were fires burning everywhere now, and none of them were accidents. Someone lit them, carefully, methodically, over decades. And I had just found the first match. There's a point in every long, drawn-out war where you stop counting battles and start counting scars, where you no longer care who threw the first punch, because everything inside you is bruised and raw, and the only thing left that matters is how it all ends. That was where I stood now, with the letters, the burner phone, the tape of my dead mother's voice, and a silence between Bob and me so thick it felt like walking through ash. He hadn't listened to the tape yet, and I hadn't pushed him to. Not because I thought he couldn't handle it, but because I wasn't sure I could. I wasn't sure I could look him in the eye and say the words out loud, what Linda said, what my mother didn't deny, what it might mean about everything I thought I knew about my family. And yet, with all that sitting heavy on the table between us, Bob looked at me with the softest expression I'd ever seen on him and said something that knocked the wind out of my anger. "I don't want revenge, Ella. I just want peace." He said it like it was a prayer, like it was the last thing he could believe in after 30 years of living under Linda's thumb. And I understood it. I did. But it also made me sick. Because the thing about peace is, it sounds noble, it sounds holy, but sometimes peace is just silence dressed up for church. And sometimes silence is how monsters keep eating. Linda hadn't said a word since Easter. Not to me. Not to Bob. Not even to the rest of the family, as far as I could tell. But that didn't mean she wasn't working. No, Linda never stopped working. She didn't need to scream to burn a house down. She just moved a few pieces, adjusted the curtains, whispered in the right ears, and suddenly it was your fault the place smelled like smoke. Bob told me he was planning to move out quietly, in a few weeks, just take his essentials and go live with his brother upstate while the paperwork moved forward. He didn't want to fight her. He didn't want to drag it all out. He just wanted out. I nodded, biting down on everything inside me that wanted to scream, that wanted to push him to expose her, to rip the mask off and let the whole damn church see the monster underneath. But it wasn't my marriage, and it wasn't my escape. It was his. I told myself to respect that. Until I found out she was already trying to pull him back in. I got a message from Brian, rare enough that I assumed he'd either grown a spine or had an agenda, and he told me in his usual vague, cowardly way that Mom's been going to Dad's job site. He said she brought him lunch twice. Said she cried. Said she talked about the good old days. Said she asked if he remembered their honeymoon. And that was all it took for me to see the playbook unfolding. Linda had no intention of letting Bob go without a fight. She just didn't fight like the rest of us. She didn't shout. She didn't beg. She made herself small, soft. She weaponized nostalgia, guilt, and the illusion of fragility until her victim convinced himself to stay. That was her brilliance. She didn't win arguments, she rewrote history. When I confronted Bob, he didn't deny it. He said she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Said she missed how simple things used to be. Said she wanted to go to counseling. I almost laughed. I almost punched a wall. But instead, I said, "And do you believe her?" He didn't answer. Which was worse than a yes. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I kept thinking about all the women I'd known who'd spent their lives shrinking for the sake of someone else's comfort. I kept hearing Linda's voice on that tape, and my mother's silence. I kept thinking about how peace can look like poison when you've been taught to swallow it politely. And sometime around 3 a.m., I made a decision I knew I wouldn't be proud of. A line I crossed not because it would fix anything, but because I was tired of waiting for someone else to do the right thing. The next morning, I dropped the tape in an envelope with no return address. I mailed it to the church office. It wasn't a noble move. It wasn't brave. It was angry and personal and ugly. I told myself it was to protect Bob, to make sure Linda didn't get to play saint while dragging him back into her web. But if I'm honest, and I haven't said this to anyone, not even myself until right now, I did it because I wanted her to burn. I wanted the whispers. I wanted the stunned faces during Sunday service. I wanted the same cold shame she made me feel growing up to crawl up her spine and into her perfect smile. I didn't want peace. I wanted the war she started to finally come back to her doorstep. But here's the thing about fire, it doesn't always burn clean. You think you're aiming it at the monster, and suddenly the smoke's in your own lungs. A few days later, I got a call from Bob. His voice was different. He didn't sound angry. He sounded disappointed, hurt. Not because he knew what I did. Not exactly. But because he'd heard about a disruption at the church, and someone mentioned a private tape, and now he couldn't walk into that building without seeing people's eyes shift when he passed. He said, "I just want it out, Ella. Not this." And I couldn't answer. Because he was right. I crossed a line, and I knew it. I did it for reasons that weren't pure. I did it because somewhere in me, that wounded girl still wanted her to pay. And maybe that makes me no better. Maybe that makes me just another person too damaged to walk away clean. But it's done now. The match was struck. The flames are crawling, and there's no going back. Let it burn. The silence that followed Easter Sunday didn't last long, because families like ours never stay quiet for long when there's drama to pick apart and sides to choose. By Tuesday morning, I started getting the texts. Not direct ones, of course, nothing that would require too much courage or clarity, but the vague, feel-you-out kind of messages that say everything by what they leave unsaid. Cousin Mark sent a simple, crazy weekend. While Aunt Rita offered a neutral but loaded, "Hope you're holding up okay." It was like they were fishing without bait, just dropping lines into the water to see who might bite. But I didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't ready to translate everyone's cowardice into politeness just yet. Bob had officially moved in with his brother by then, a modest place about 2 hours out, far enough to give him peace, but close enough that I could still check on him if I needed to. He left Linda the house, which made my stomach turn, but I understood why. He didn't want to fight over bricks and wood. He wanted to leave with his dignity intact, and if that meant surrendering the castle to the dragon, then so be it. But Linda wasn't licking her wounds quietly. No, she was already doing what she did best, curating a version of the story that made her the tragic heroine, abandoned by a man who couldn't handle the complexities of marriage. By the following weekend, she was hosting a family dinner of her own. No Easter ham this time, just a casual come-by-for-dessert gathering where she could control the conversation and reclaim the stage. And of course, most of them went. Because in this family, showing up isn't about loyalty, it's about staying in good standing. About not making yourself a target. I didn't go. I stayed home and waited, fully aware that someone would call me afterward to relay the second-hand theatrics. I didn't have to wait long. Brian, of all people, showed up on my porch late that night, smelling faintly of cheap Chardonnay and something heavier, regret, maybe, though I'd never give him the credit that easily. He looked tired, not in the physical sense, but in that way people look when the lies they've clung to are finally slipping through their fingers and they're not sure what's left underneath. He didn't ask to come in. Just stood there on the porch, jacket wrinkled, tie loose, face sagging under the weight of too many unspoken things. When he finally spoke, it wasn't what I expected. "She's spinning it," he said, voice hoarse like he'd been yelling or trying not to. Said Bob's going through a breakdown. Told everyone you planted stuff to make her look bad. I laughed, sharp and humorless. Of course she did. He nodded like he'd expected that reaction, then stared out into the dark yard like he was waiting for it to offer him courage. She cried in front of Aunt Rita. Told her she never cheated, never lied. Said the letters were fake, or old, or misunderstood. "And you?" I asked, folding my arms. "Did you believe her?" He didn't answer right away, which told me everything I needed to know. He was still holding on, still weighing her lies against the truth, trying to see which one offered him the softest place to land. "She's our mom," he finally said. I don't know how to stop believing her. "That's not my problem," I said. Maybe too cold, maybe too honest. "She's your mom, but she ruined other people's lives, Brian. Including mine. Including your father's. You don't get to hide behind biology anymore." He closed his eyes, rubbed the bridge of his nose. "She said something tonight. About your mom." My whole body tensed. "She said your mom used to imagine things. That she wasn't well. That he stopped himself, like the words were hot in his mouth, and he didn't want to burn them into existence. She said your mom made up stories to feel important." I could feel the heat rising in my chest. Not the kind of rage that explodes, but the kind that settles deep in your bones and waits. "And you believe that?" "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said, and for a second, he looked younger than I'd seen him in years. Like the little boy I used to know before Linda crowned him king. There was a long pause then, the kind that usually ends with someone walking away. But instead, he did something I didn't expect. He sat down on the porch steps and started to cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly, like he'd finally run out of versions to protect. And for a moment, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel for him in a long, long time: pity. Maybe he wasn't the villain I'd always cast him as. Maybe he was just another casualty of the same woman, in a different costume. But that didn't mean I trusted him. It didn't mean I was ready to let him rewrite his part in the story. He'd let me take the fall too many times. He'd benefited from my silence, my scapegoating, my exile. So when he finally stood up, wiped his face, and said, "I think she's scared," I didn't reach out. I didn't offer comfort. I just looked at him and said, "She should be." Because this time, the story wasn't hers to tell. And the people she used to control with a look, with a tear, with a soft twist of the truth, they were finally waking up. But the tension in the family had hit a peak. And peaks mean falls. Someone was going to break next. Someone was going to pick a side and not come back from it. The table was split now, clean down the center. And it wasn't just about Linda anymore. It was about everything no one had ever dared to say. It ended, not with shouting or slamming doors or the kind of dramatic finale you see in movies, but with the quiet scrape of a chair on hardwood and the sound of Linda's heels clicking out the front door like punctuation marks to a story that had already told itself. No one followed her. No one tried to stop her. She didn't say goodbye. Just gathered her purse, her pride, and whatever scraps of narrative she had left, and left behind a room full of people too stunned, or too tired, to play their parts any longer. Bob stood by the window, back straight, face unreadable, holding a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He didn't watch her leave. Didn't turn to see the car door slam or the tires crunch over gravel. He just stood there, letting the quiet settle into his shoulders like he'd finally shrugged off a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying all these years. The dignity he left with wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, slow, earned the hard way through decades of swallowing his needs for the sake of someone else's peace. And me? I sat at the table, staring at the half-eaten lemon pie no one had touched since the storm rolled through. My fork still resting on the plate like I'd forgotten it was there. And maybe I had. Maybe I'd forgotten a lot of things. Like what it feels like to sit in a room and not be the subject of whispered judgment or backhanded sympathy. Like what it feels like to finally speak and not have your words twisted into another excuse to call you broken. The room was thick with silence, not the uncomfortable kind that needs filling, but the kind that hangs like steam after something scalding has boiled over. I looked around and saw faces I'd known my whole life, now looking back at me like I was someone they'd never really seen before. Aunt Rita with her lips pressed into a thin, uncertain line. Mark chewing his lip like he was trying to remember how to speak. Even Danielle looked like she wanted to say something, but wasn't sure what side of the line she stood on anymore. No one congratulated me. No one thanked me. And I didn't expect them to, because the truth is, no matter how right you are, exposing a lie that big, one that's been dressed in family dinners and holiday prayers and forced hugs for years, doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you visible. And people don't know what to do with someone they can no longer pretend isn't there. Eventually, people started leaving, one by one, in awkward clusters. No hugs. No promises to call. Just the shuffling exit of people who had suddenly realized they'd been standing on a stage with no script. Bob left quietly too, nodding to me once with a look that said everything and nothing at the same time. Gratitude. Regret. Maybe even a little bit of grief. I nodded back, and then he was gone. I was the last one in the house. Alone, finally, in the echo of what we'd all just lived through. I stood up, cleared the plates slowly, letting the clatter of dishes remind me that the world was still turning even though everything felt like it had stopped. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just moved like someone who had finally stepped out of the fog, only to find she wasn't sure where the road ahead led now. I should have felt peace. I told myself I would. That once it was all out in the open, once Linda was stripped of her mask and Bob had escaped, I'd feel some kind of closure, some neat emotional resolution that would tie up years of being the family's shame closet. But instead, I felt nothing. Or maybe too much of something I couldn't name. Relief and guilt. Victory and loneliness. All tangled together in a knot I wasn't sure would ever fully loosen. Because here's the part they don't tell you about the truth: it doesn't heal everything. It breaks things too. It cuts. It reshapes. It turns old wounds into new questions. Like, what exactly had my mother been covering for all those years? What did Linda mean when she said I was too much like my father? Why hadn't anyone ever stopped her, all those times she humiliated me with a smile and called it concern? And then, of course, there was the other question. The one I hadn't let myself ask until that very moment. Had I gone too far? Sending that tape to the church wasn't justice. It wasn't healing. It was war. It was me lighting the match after years of being told I was the one who brought the smoke. And yes, part of me did it for Bob. But the bigger part? The one I don't talk about? That part wanted to hurt her. Wanted her to feel one fraction of what she made me feel every time she looked at me and saw only someone to blame. So maybe I wasn't the hero in all this. Maybe I was just another person who learned how to fight by watching someone else manipulate the rules. And maybe the hardest truth of all was realizing I wasn't sure who I'd become in the process. The last bite of pie sat there on the plate, untouched, already going soft around the edges. And for reasons I can't quite explain, I picked up the fork and took it. Not because I was hungry, but because it felt like some kind of ending. Or maybe just a ritual. One last bite, one last echo of the story we'd all been pretending wasn't burning from the inside out. I finished it, stood up, and walked to the door, not looking back, not needing to. Outside, The sky was gray but clearing, like it hadn't decided yet whether to rain or not. And I understood that feeling more than I ever had before. Some stories don't end. They just pause. Waiting. And this one? It was still smoldering.